All right, so our next speaker, Dr. Anna Cates, also from the University of Minnesota. She is the State Soil Health Specialist with the U of M Extension and Minnesota Office for Soil Health. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. She studies soil organic matter, soil function, and conservation cropping systems out of her lab in St. Paul. Her outreach across Minnesota focuses on increasing capacity of local staff to promote and support soil health practices in row crops. And Anna holds a master's in soil science and agroecology and a PhD in agronomy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So this morning she's going to share with us how these processes work in ag soil, what she hopes to change with soil health principles, and how manure and livestock can alter processes and properties underground. So,
hey, how's my volume? I know I don't have a PowerPoint yet, so I am working on that. Yeah, see if you can. Great. That looks like me. I changed my title. I'm an inveterate title changer between when I submit the abstract and when I give the talk, but it's pretty similar content. She just gave a brief bio, but I looked through this conference proceedings yesterday to kind of see where I was headed this morning and realized I have a pretty different background from most of the people who are here, and so I'm actually going to start just by talking a little bit more about myself and how I got to be interested in the questions that I work on. So when I was a little kid, my parents raised, they had a cow-calf operation in southern Wisconsin. And apparently that kind of got in my blood. I got interested in farming. My family still runs cattle on this land. So I'm actually headed there tonight for a meeting in Wisconsin. I have a lot of connections back there from grad school. After undergraduate, I got interested in just growing food. And I worked on a lot of small farms, little CSA farms, vegetable operations, things like that. But I wanted to better understand how the big picture of growing food for people affected the environment. And I thought I wasn't really getting that from my experience on these small farms, although it's a fun community and really interesting work and all that stuff. So I went back to school and I studied mostly soil carbon at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So in this picture, I'm measuring the respiration from the soil, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. I thought that carbon was a nice sort of unifying principle of soil quality. And now I work in this position doing soil health outreach across the state. I've been here since 2018, so a few years, just getting to where maybe I can't call myself new anymore. As she said, I work statewide as an extension professor. I'm part of this thing called the Minnesota Office for Soil Health, which is a collaboration between our state conservation agency, the Board of Water and Soil Resources, and the Water Resources Center on campus. So it's kind of a unique position in that the state agency has poured some money into a university position in order to make sure that the university is serving these employees around the state who work for what we call soil and water conservation districts, but the university is also a partner in it. So in a lot of ways I look like a normal extension professor, but I do interact a little bit more with state agencies who are really grappling with how best to incentivize sustainable land use across our very agricultural lands. Okay, so what I was going to talk about today, I was going to start with sort of soil health and the basics, essentially how does soil work. Has anybody in this room taken a soil science class? Okay. I figured that had to be under the hood of some animal science degrees, but I wasn't quite sure. So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about Soils 101 for those of you who haven't or haven't heard this in a while. And then I'm going to talk specifically, I found a great review paper about how swine manure specifically affects soil health, so I'll review some of that data. And then we'll see if I get to all the rest of this. I packed it in with a few different topics, but I want to make sure we get to this end question about soil carbon. I think that's one of the most direct ways that my work intersects with how manure can alter our environmental outcomes, I would say. Okay, so soil health is in my job description, my job title, and so I always think I should start with a definition of it because it's a pretty loosey-goosey term that you see a lot around the popular press as well as the scientific press. This is the NRCS definition, that's National Resource Conservation Service. The continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem. And I really like this definition because it centers on the word function. and that it reinforces that soil health is going to look different in different contexts. So the soil health of your yard is not going to look exactly the same as the soil health of your cornfield. It's not going to look the same as the soil health in a wetland. These are all different areas. They're all performing different functions for different users, be they human or otherwise. And so it forces us to think, what functions do we care about? I mostly think about this in an agronomic row crop context, but you could apply this to any situation where you want to say, am I happy with how this soil is performing? Am I happy with how this piece of land is providing the functions that I'm interested in? So one kind of, I believe this was developed slightly as a joke, but it really works, I think, this flow chart to get at whether your soil is healthy or not. I have credited an extension colleague at Washington State who has publicized this more widely. So you ask yourself some questions. Does your soil blow or flow away? If it does, probably not healthy. If it does not, you're on the right track. Does it allow water to soak in quickly? Yes or no? Does it drain? That means, does water flow through to the water table? Does it crust? So do you see a kind of impervious layer on the surface that doesn't let water in? Does your crop recover most of the nutrients you apply? Are there areas where plants die or grow poorly? So you could replace these with other functions that you care about. For example, in your yard, does this soil provide green grass for you and your family to have a picnic on? Maybe that's the most important function for your soil. But these are several that are important for agronomic concerns. A couple of things I like to point out, a lot of them are about water. I'm going to talk about organic matter quite a bit and microbes. Microbes have gotten a lot of attention in the soil health world, but a lot of the functions that we care about with our soil are about water. How fast is it going through? Are we getting enough of it? It becomes apparent every time we have extreme droughts and precipitation events, whether our soil is functioning at these two extremes. So I'm going to talk mostly the next few minutes about how a healthy soil can provide certain functions as relates to water. The last thing I want to say is this last question, are there areas where plants die or grow poorly? Soil health has gotten a real complicated reputation in some ways. It's about your microbiome of your soil or something like that. But just look at whether the plants are thriving. If the plants are thriving, your soil is more likely to be healthy than not. Okay. So this is what the soil is made of as we talk about it in physical terms. The big brown element is minerals, that's sand, silt, and clay. And then the blue side represents voids. So you essentially have half solids and half voids. The little green sliver is the organic material. So that is just differentiated from rock, things that have come from plants, etc. In here, the soil pore space is split about evenly between air and water. That actual balance is going to vary temporally, and it's going to vary spatially depending on the properties of your soil. This is another image of the physical makeup of soil. And so this sort of shows you how those four components interact: the air, the water, the minerals, and the organic matter. And what I really like about this is that it's just a total mess. And we all like to think that our scientific system is one of the more complicated ones. But really, I think that trying to understand what's happening in soil is very complicated because it's so heterogeneous on this micro scale. So when we talk about organic matter in the soil, it's not evenly distributed like baking soda through a muffin batter or something like that. It's really patchy in the soil. There's a little bit in this pore and a little bit in that pore and a little bit in that pore. So when we think about the functions our soil is providing, it's actually going to be really spatially heterogeneous at this small scale. So some roots are going to access certain nutrients and some roots will access other nutrients. And plants know how to work within that system, right? That's why root systems look the way they do, is so they can explore all of this space. Okay, soil organic matter. This is a picture of a food web as it sort of exists underground. Just like a food web above ground, your plants are your primary productivity. They're pulling in carbon from the atmosphere and creating their plant bodies. That's feeding small organisms. Some of them are directly feeding on plants. Sometimes this is a bad thing, a plant root nematode or something like that. More often it's a good thing. The roots are directly exuding carbon towards microbes in the system. And I have microbes represented as these squiggles and that kind of thing. And there's 4 different iterations of them with the arrows between them because as microbes die or excrete other compounds, those are taken up by microbes again, recycled and recycled. On top of that, you have all these other organisms. So earthworms are kind of the poster child for the biology we want in the soil, in a healthy soil. But there's a lot of other organisms on a smaller scale that are kind of living in different nooks and crannies in the soil. We don't actually know that well what all of these organisms eat. I had a colleague in grad school in the entomology lab next door whose project was based on centrifuging lady beetles until they vomited and then analyzing the DNA of that vomit because we just didn't know what they were eating. So there's things that are eating the microbes, there's things that are eating each other at this microscopic scale, and above that you're going to have insects, both beneficial and pests. And we don't know very clearly how those organisms all depend on each other to create the services that we're most interested in. And I'm getting to those services and function, but I want to give you a sense of where everything lives first. Okay, this is a little bit more about the physical habitat, and it just has to do with the texture of the soil. People are often going to say you have a clayey soil, or a sandy soil, or a silty, loamy soil, that kind of thing. Clay are the small particles, and sand are the big particles. And that's the most important thing to understand the difference. This is what the surface of clay looks like. This is actually many, many pieces of clay that self-organize into these sheets. So it looks like a paperback that's been dumped into a bathtub, but then you try to dry it out and it never really works again. But at any rate, you have a lot of surface area, and that's where microbes hang out, that's where water is stuck most closely, that's where organic material hangs out. So your clay is what really determines how much organic material you're going to be able to get in your soil. The next level of organization on top of those layers of clay are these soil aggregates. And that's more what you can actually see with your eyes. If you pick up a chunk of soil and look at the little sort of dreadlocks that hang on to the roots, that is the soil aggregates at the next level up. Aggregates are held together by those sticky glues on the outside of clays, and they're also held together by the stringy fungal hyphae and roots on top of that. And let's see if I can get this little video to play, because this is an actual compilation of many x-rays of the aggregate. And you can see inside the aggregate you have these big brown chunks of organic matter, that kind of like a rock inside a snowball or something like that. And you also have the mineral material in gray, and then the blue is all the pores. So you can see that within the soil structure there's areas that are high in organic matter, areas that are low in organic matter, and pores scattered throughout. I realize that I'm using this abbreviation OM for organic matter repeatedly. I apologize for not pointing that out earlier, but that's what OM means if it's repeated again. Okay, so why do we care about all these? Well, those aggregates can improve your infiltration of your soil. On the left, you have a soil that is not well aggregated. The surface looks smooth. That's if you imagine looking down on it. On the right, you have a soil that's better aggregated. The surface looks more heterogeneous and lumpy. If you look at this cutaway element, then you can see that between all the small particles in the poorly aggregated soil, the water can't get in very, very well. Those are small holes. On the right-hand side, you have the aggregates that are bigger, and you have more large pathways for water to get through. Okay, so that's good. Infiltration is really important when it's really wet. But what about this year? We didn't want infiltration in Minnesota, and across much of the Midwest we had drought, so we wanted water holding capacity. But aggregates can actually give us that too, because all those pores that I showed you in the X-ray are holding water inside. So we really want these two very different functions from soil. We want small pores to hold water for a long time, and we want big pores to let the water through rapidly when it comes. And sandy soils are going to naturally have the big pores that let water through, and clayey soils are going to naturally have the small pores that hold water for a long time. But if you can create soil structure, which you get by reducing disturbance and having living roots in the ground for more of the year, then you can get both functions again. This is a little visual of just a couple 2-second videos of how this works out in the field. So over here, what we did was we took this device and we rained a certain amount on the soil over a period of time. And over here we have a really poorly structured soil, and it just turns into jello. That soil isn't going to let any more water in. It just turned into a mud pie. Over here we have a well-structured soil, and it still looks like soil. It's not goop. It's going to let more water in. So they took in the same amount of water, and one turned into goo, and one remained intact. So that gives you a sense of how the function of a healthy versus a less healthy soil reacts when you apply some water. I will say that this visual resonates with any farmer who's looked at their land after a rainstorm and thought about, if they're seeing this on the left, they're disappointed. If they're seeing what's on the right, they're happy. But I have yet to find a really good way to measure this in the lab. I'm going to talk about a couple measurements, but this visual is almost better than anything I'm able to replicate in the lab. So soil health is still kind of instinctual, unfortunately. All right, so these are the soil health principles. Keep the soil covered. That just prevents erosion, makes it less likely to blow away. Minimize disturbance. Disturbance really refers to tillage, especially. When you run a piece of metal through the soil, you break up those aggregates, you lose that function. Increase crop diversity. This has to do with feeding your microbes a diverse diet, and it also allows you to do things like break up pest and disease cycles. Keeping living roots in the ground kind of integrates all those three, because if you're going to keep living roots in the ground, you're going to need plants that grow in both the cool season and the warm season. You're not going to be able to till because you're trying to keep that plant growing, and it keeps the soil covered. Okay, integrating livestock. This is maybe what we really came for. Thank you for bearing with the amount of background that I gave, though. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this happens, but when you integrate livestock, you've got this manure addition, and you also have an economic change to the system. Integrating livestock actually makes it easier to do the other principles, because if you're starting in a corn-soybean rotation, you really have no reason to add alfalfa to that system unless you're dealing with livestock. You have no reason to grow a small grain and have the straw unless you have livestock in this system. You have no reason to let your cover crop grow a little longer unless you want to put animals out there and graze it. So as we are tight on the economics and row crop systems, the livestock can make a lot of these other principles pay off more quickly, I'll say. Okay, so back to this food web. The next thing I'm going to talk about is just how adding livestock into the system changes how the microbial processing happens and changes some of our soil organic matter pools. So I don't know how many of you looked at a soil test recently, but usually soil organic matter is just listed as a percent by mass of the whole soil system. It is a compilation of the plant particles, the microbial particles, any little bits of manure. It could be things that have been decomposed, 1,000 years ago. It could include things that were decomposed this year. So it's a real heterogeneous mixture. I'm going to show you that, and then also a couple of sort of more specific elements of that soil organic matter pool. I was lucky when I was preparing this talk to see that there was recently a big review of swine manure, in particular on soil health properties. So I'm going to focus on that for this group. Okay. So this looks at several different fertility sources and the change in organic matter relative to an untreated control. And this is a percent change in soil organic matter. So, a 50% change would mean going from like 4 to 6% organic matter, for example. This is that whole soil organic matter pool. So this is really interesting, and other studies have shown this too, that solid manure is this SM category, and it does have some of the highest values. But manure plus inorganic fertilizer also has really high values. And I've seen this in other studies too, where combining the two fertility sources can really be good for plant productivity and plant health overall. I don't know exactly why that is. I don't know if anybody does, but it kind of nudges us all towards thinking as holistically as possible about different nutrient sources and practices on the landscape, I think. Another interesting element from this study, this is again percent change in soil organic matter, is that you're going to have different benefits on different textures of soil. So this is no surprise to any soil scientist, and it fits in with what I was talking about before, in that our medium and fine textured soils are more likely to aggregate to build that structure because they have more surface area for microbes and that kind of thing to hang around on. So they essentially, sometimes coarse soils change really fast because they start really low in organic matter, but usually your fine textured soils kind of have more capacity to build structure and protect organic matter within that structure. Last one I'm going to show from that study is the change in organic matter with time of manure application, duration. So this axis is probably kind of small, but we go from less than 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, and 20 to 30. So longer term manure application is likely to give you more benefit than those first couple of years. Soil does change slowly. A lot of the popular press on soil health might suggest that, soil health, you can build soil rapidly. But we soil scientists kind of put the brakes on that. You can build organic matter, you can improve your soil, but building actual soil is more on the generational time scale, something you do for your grandchildren, not something you can do for your next year's bottom line, unfortunately. And then there's a couple of pieces of data from that meta-analysis about physical properties, and generally it holds up that the effect on physical properties is positive with manure. You have lower density, meaning more porosity, and a little bit increase in infiltration, although there's almost no research on that. Okay. I think I'm actually going to skip this Minnesota research. I hope you will get a chance to hear from Melissa and Manny in the next couple of years at this conference, but I'm going to scoot on to talking about this economic so that we have some time for questions at the end. So like I said, the livestock can make these systems more profitable. Cover crops are a crop that is grown outside your cash crop growing season, generally seeded in the fall and terminated in the spring. Some growers are using that for feed. So this is a picture of a guy who has his cows out in the snow and he's grown something over the summer such that there's still a little feed stockpiled there, that kind of thing. These are in corn stalks is all, but people do it with all kinds of crops now. So this data from a region-wide survey on cover crops has a lot of different pieces to it. First, it shows the years of cover cropping in the columns, year 1, year 3, and year 5. On the top, it shows that what they estimate as input savings from using cover crops. Those are those first few bars. So you can save a little money sometimes, certainly on erosion repair. The idea is that cover crops might help you control weeds. So you see modest savings in the $25 to $40 an acre realm. They also show that you are going to have to pay to put the seed on, right? So that column here, or this row here, cost of seed and seeding, they estimate at $37 on average, which is certainly low for current rates, I would think. And so overall, this is your net return just on cover cropping by itself. It's not great. The first year is almost certainly negative, and then it might get better as your soil, as your weed seed bank goes down and your cover crops are better able to control weeds, for example, or if they're able to provide more nutrients over time. But they have these special situations where they think cover crops can pay off faster. One is essentially facing severe herbicide-resistant weeds, and then another is grazing income. So this is where cover crops can help or where grazing, in particular, can help your cover crops pay off immediately. You immediately get to a positive return and a higher positive return over time. We now have some data in Minnesota on this that is sort of being collected. This is maybe the third year it'll be collected as cover crops used on Minnesota farms, and this is with the Farm Business Management Program in Minnesota. We have one of the biggest financial farm databases in the country, I believe. You can access it anytime on FinBin is the website, and they've just made it possible to do more cover crop type analyses. So they have about, I'm not going to get the number right, it's somewhere between 10 and 100 farms in this first couple of years of data, and they separated out a couple of different categories of cover crops for silage or for forage, and those are the ones where people are starting to actually have a return on their cover crops, whereas in other cases the return is not direct. This is a really interesting data report if you're interested in this topic. There's a lot of different nuances in the information. I think maybe I'll do one more little piece here, and then I'll stop. I just want to talk about the manure and carbon story. So you might hear a lot about carbon credits in the environment. Generally, carbon credits are assumed when your agricultural management practices leave your soil with more carbon or more organic matter than they would have otherwise. And essentially, organic carbon changes in the soil are a balance of photosynthesis and microbial respiration. So microbial respiration is that processing of organic matter in the soil. And manure can give you a little bit more carbon in the system, right? However, on the global scale, that's the same carbon that was coming in anyway from photosynthesis. So it can improve your local carbon balance, but doesn't do much for our global carbon balance. Which is not to say that farmers who aren't using this as a practice to build carbon shouldn't perhaps get some credit for it. But it is a local benefit, to make that obvious. Okay. So what I wanted to show you was this data from a Minnesota study where he looked at the carbon inputs and outputs from several different systems. These are in western Minnesota primarily. And so the blue is the carbon that's going into the system, and it's either plants or there's these little bits of manure in the silage system and in the alfalfa system. And it's a small amount relative to the total carbon that's produced in the system, but it can make a little bit of a positive difference. The other parts of this figure are the yellow elements, which are the carbon loss through harvest and through microbial respiration, and then the red, which is just a sum of the blue and the yellow. So mostly negative across these cropping systems. We're not building carbon in our Minnesota cropping systems. But one positive piece of evidence I wanted to show you guys is that the carbon balance, so that positive minus negative, is higher, first of all, just when you leave residue on the soil, so when you're able to leave your corn stalks behind. And then it's also higher when this manure carbon in per harvest carbon out is higher. So that means that you can replace some of the harvested carbon, for example, in a corn silage system, with manure carbon, and that can be positive for your overall soil carbon balance. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thanks everybody for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. I think that was very eye-opening.
Thanks. Maybe you were just getting to this too. I don't know if it lends itself to a simple answer, but there are a handful of like most generally utilized models for soil carbon sequestration. And how accurate are they? I mean, in other words, you say, oh, it's a half ton per acre or something like that. Plus or minus what? Is there an easy answer to that question?
No. No, the models are really problematic. They're not terrible. There's good scientists working on them. They're not trying to mess it up. But there's just big error bars on it. Yeah, one of the slides I didn't get to is showing how carbon is coming in and out of the system at a temporally variable rate. So carbon is essentially coming in through photosynthesis, mostly in June. And then it gets hot and the microbes catch up and the carbon's mostly going out of the system. So and if your June is conducive to plant growth, you're much more likely to see carbon sequestration that year. If it's not, then you're more likely to have respiration beat out the photosynthesis and you're going to be behind on carbon sequestration. So I don't know if the models can fully get all that. And again, remember that picture of soil and the heterogeneous landscape? You know, respiration is happening in those little tiny pockets of the soil, and if some of them are wetter than others, there's just a lot of variability. Yeah.
So just a couple quick things here. When we're talking about trying to increase the soil carbon level or organic matter, and I don't know if those two are correlated or what they're, are we talking primarily increases through the action associated with the root system, everything below ground, or is part of that also due to the organic matter that's on top, even though it's being broken down and the carbon's being released as CO2? And the other part of that then is starting to read stuff around this whole liquid carbon process associated with stimulating plants to increase output of sugars into the soil.
Mm-hmm. Okay. First of all, sorry, yes, organic matter is about 55% carbon. So I use them pretty interchangeably, but you know, your total carbon number is going to be about half your organic matter number. Is the carbon in the soil mostly from above ground or below ground? As I showed just briefly that slide showing that how much residue you leave on the surface makes a difference. So yes, the above ground does matter, but there's a higher efficiency of stabilization for below ground carbon. So if you put a ton of roots versus a ton of residue, more of the roots will be around in 10 years than the residue on top. In terms of feeding plants sugar to increase root exudation, I don't think that's likely to be efficient on a large scale. It holds up biologically, but it's not likely to work in a widespread way.
I'm not sure about feeding sugar, maybe you said, but stimulating plants to increase
Oh,
photosynthesis
yeah.
and increase the percentage of sugars produced within that photosynthesis system.
That's a super interesting question. So just in case people didn't hear it, not feeding plants sugar, which is a thing people do, but stimulating plants to produce more sugars, which is a primary way that they feed microbes and build soil carbon. So it's a great pathway. It would be really cool if we could figure out how to do it. I've actually seen that the highest root exudate production rates tend to happen when the plant is just slightly stressed, which it's a fine line to walk for somebody who's has their livelihood depending on not stressing their plant out.
Wonderful. Thanks. Let's give Anna another round of applause.